So welcome, everyone. We're really excited to have you all here today to take part in the relaunch of the Inclusive Disaster Risk Management and Gender Equality Knowledge Silo Breaker. My name is Zoe Trohanis. I'm a lead disaster risk management specialist working at the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. So I'll be kind of the MC for today. And we have a great set of speakers joining us. So to kick things off, I would like to invite Same Waba, who's our Global Director for the Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience, and Land Global Practice, to give us some opening remarks before we dive in. So Same, please.
Thank you, Zoe, and welcome to everyone. I mean, it's great really to be relaunching officially the Inclusive Disaster Risk Management and the Gender Equality Knowledge Silo Breaker. I mean, it's an issue that is very, very important to our work and will be especially relevant in helping, bring together experience from across the bank and helping team to operationalize, if you will, approaches to inclusion within disaster risk management. I mean, if anything, this past year and a half has really showed us the importance of this agenda, as the pandemic has continued to, worsen living conditions, reduce and affect economic opportunities, and specifically for vulnerable populations. And therefore, we're starting to see the inequalities that existed exacerbating even more or getting created. We're seeing it within countries, across countries, and with the vaccination nonetheless, not the least. Now, for us, inclusive and resilient development is at the heart of what we do at the World Bank. I mean, if you will have heard one acronym of late, it's GRID, which is Green, Resilient, and Inclusive Development, and the dimensions of inclusion and resilience, which is at the heart of what we do at GFDRR and at the heart of this KSB, are particularly important. Now, KSBs for us are especially important because they're communities of practice, they're knowledge hubs, they bring together good practices, experiences, and share the knowledge that we have across regions, across sectors. And the recent gender dimensions of disaster risk and resilience, that report that was released last March, basically has emphasized that disasters are experienced differently by gender, with women being more disadvantaged in low and middle income countries where there are gender gaps, whether they're in terms of access to information or disaster preparedness, access to public shelter, limits on mobility, and so on and so forth. And we also know that poverty and disability are interlinked. So, a person with disability is more vulnerable in a context of a disaster because, of obviously, the disability, but also the fact that they experience, adverse socioeconomic outcomes that are much worse. So the moment you start doing these intersectionalities, of gender, disability, of, socioeconomic status, etc., you have, situations of vulnerability that really impede us from doing what we are supposed to do, which is leaving no one behind. So again, what's really great is that in this one KSB, and I understand it used to be separate before, you're bringing together, the people, the communities, the experiences to explore these intersectionalities of how people are excluded in DRM programs and how to tackle that. And this is the type of experience that we really need to have, and we need to mainstream, as with our work on disaster risk management and resilience, across all global practices. So that's why I'm really, really excited to be joining you today. I hope you guys, the audience and others who couldn't participate today, would engage, and because a KSB is as good as its membership and their active engagement. So it's you who will make that community of work tick, and I'm really excited to be joining you. So with that, back to you, Zoe.
Thank you, Same, for those nice opening remarks. So maybe just to kick things off, I'd like to give a little bit of context before we dive into some of the details and experiences from other countries. So it's important, I think, and Same touched on it, in his opening remarks. But so for this KSB, what exactly are the objectives? What is it? So this, I mean, what we're envisioning to work with all of you on is to provide an informal platform to connect disaster risk management, to connect teams working on DRM projects and programs to better integrate aspects of inclusion. And the idea really is to share lessons, good practice across regions, bring in external partners and expertise as needed. And we'll hear from the Romania team of some interesting work they've been doing in this regard. And it's also to promote brainstorming and dialogue among staff. And so it's not only for the DRM team to talk to the DRM team, right? So it's really to bring in experience across, as Sami mentioned, other GSGs, KSBs, and of course, across global practices. And there we can hopefully leverage expertise and really zoom in on the challenges and opportunities that teams and our clients face to promote inclusion in the DRM sector. Next slide, please. So it's also important, we thought, just to make sure we're all on the same page when we're talking about inclusive disaster risk management. What are we talking about, and why is it important? So inclusive DRM is really about promoting resilience for everyone by improving the terms for marginalized groups, especially, so that they can also benefit from and take part in DRM projects and programs. And the goal is to really empower and expand opportunities, abilities, and of course, dignity among these groups. We know, of course, that disasters do not affect all groups equally. The poor and marginalized are especially vulnerable. And also, as Sami mentioned, of course, the World Bank, we've prioritized inclusion as part of the GRID approach for COVID-19 recovery, our corporate commitments, our twin goals. And especially with the focus on disability inclusion and gender equality and citizen engagement. So in order to kind of, for this relaunch, because there's been a lot of work done and there are many teams working across different aspects of inclusion on DRM programs, we undertook a rapid stock take, sort of a diagnostic to see in terms of the DRM programs that we're doing here at the bank to see what's been working and what's not. So we wrapped that up during the end of the last fiscal year. So I thought it would be good to kind of give you guys an overview of that to set the scene for the work program of the KSB. And it included also a portfolio review and some interviews with different task team leaders and different teams to get perspective. So the first step, and this is based on the methodology of the Inclusion Matters report the World Bank published in 2013, but our social development consultant, first we started to identify really who are the people being excluded in these programs, and to look at the link between basically natural disasters and these areas of exclusion. And what are the barriers to participating and benefiting, as I had mentioned before, in DRM programs, and also to try and understand the disproportionate effects of these disasters on different groups. So as we know, group identities overlap and they're inherently diverse and dynamic. And so you can have multiple axes of exclusion being one person, right? Even if you think of yourself and your own identity. And since everyone does have their own unique identity, we need to take into account all factors that can marginalize people. So it could be across gender, race, class, sexual orientation. And this notion of intersectionality is really crucial to understand how to design programs better to be more inclusive in terms of disaster risk management. Next slide. So after looking at the who, then we tried to also understand the constraints facing these groups. And so the idea here was also, we looked at these 5 constraints you see on the screen in terms of disaster risk management specifically to help us facilitate the identification and targeting of different approaches for these types of projects to really try and understand the root issues for exclusion to the best that we can, and that helps you design better programs and projects. So again, people may face different constraints or even multiple constraints depending on their situation. So for example, I won't go through all of them because there's quite a bit of detail, and we can also share our stock take report with you all for more information. But For example, physical constraints could include things such as having continuity of services, resilience of key public infrastructure, could also include where you live, geography, your accessibility. And we know that prior to, during, and after a disaster, these constraints can affect marginalized groups to a greater extent. So for example, and we know poorer households perhaps living in areas that are vulnerable to hazard impacts that may be more, farther away from the city center, in more vulnerable areas, or even where they don't have good access to infrastructure prior to an event, or even worse off after. Next slide. So based on those constraints, sort of who's affected, how, and why, we also then tried to say, okay, well, what's working well and what's happening across the bank to find out what lessons can we draw and what could we hopefully try and draw out and do more of and support in terms of through this KSB. And so we tried to align this according to the Sendai framework, as well as these are our 4 pillars from the GFDR strategy for 2021 through 2025. So starting out with risk-informed decision-making, definitely the need for more systematic collection of inclusion-sensitive data, so gender disaggregated by sex, high resolution, geocoded, really to identify some of these marginalized groups, where they're located and potentially what their needs may be. On reducing risk and mainstreaming, really the idea of some good examples on universal design principles, both for also included in post-disaster, but also for risk reduction projects, as well as inclusive approaches for resilient infrastructure. We'll hear about the Safe Schools project in Romania as one good example of this. On financial protection, very quickly, of course, there's quite a lot going on disaster risk finance, especially on the gender side. And adaptive social protection, we found several good cases there that we can learn from, especially in terms of having institutional capacity to include marginalized groups in these social protection programs after a disaster, so preparing for it in advance. And then on preparedness and recovery, of course, early warning systems, being inclusive to meet the needs of different groups, post-disaster emergency assistance, and a lot on gender-based violence prevention and mental well-being, some good examples from Indonesia. And of course, we also looked across community engagement and some innovative tools, especially new technology that can be used there. Next slide. So how are we, I think the last point, we did take a look because there have been several portfolio reviews of what's been happening through GPearl and others. So we did a deeper dive on the GFDR side to see how is our portfolio supporting inclusion. And so we found that from FY16 through 20, about 2/3 of our grants actually did include elements of inclusion related to disability inclusion, community resilience, gender, and citizen engagement. And overall, there's an increasing trend, which is great. And we had, as you can see, starting from the right side, the highest percentage from citizen engagement, but then moving to the left, disability inclusion is really where we also need to think more strategically about how we can do better there. So I'll stop here. I just wanted to give you all a flavor, a bit of a background of how we sort of set the scene in terms of some of the key issues and gaps and where we'd like to do more, and how the KSB and all of you can support as part of it. So with that, I'd actually like to now hand over, because now we're going to hear from the field, to my colleagues, Alana Simpson, who's the lead disaster risk management specialist working in the Europe and Central Asia region, as well as Sanjay Agarwal, who's a senior social development specialist, also in the ECHA region. And they're going to give us an overview about how they tackled inclusion issues, working with the government of Romania on the Safer, Inclusive, Sustainable Schools project. So Alana, over to you, please.
Thank you so much. Will the PowerPoint be shared by, I brought up, perfect. So really happy to be here today and to talk about this project where it was a collaboration from the start across multiple practices, particularly with social, and Sanjay's here, with our energy colleagues, with our education team members, of course, and urban colleagues, and of course, DRM. So the idea behind this project was from the start to create an integrated, comprehensive solution for schools in Romania. And we know particularly in Romania that the challenge of exclusion is a big challenge. There is much lower performance in rural, poorer areas with respect to educational attainment than in urban areas. We also know that Roma children are far more likely to be marginalized. But we also know that schools are just not safe. And when we looked at safety, initially our entry point was on seismic risk, which is extremely high in Romania, and many of the schools were constructed prior to modern building codes. But beyond that, safety extended to fire risk in classrooms, lack of ventilation, dogs affecting children's safety walking to school. So safety became very broad. Inclusion, dealing with issues around access for children with disabilities, but also recognizing schools also perform a function around voting sites. And if people with disabilities can't access schools, you actually disenfranchise people from voting. So that's also an issue. And then, of course, sustainability. Schools are, incredible opportunities to create energy efficiency, learning, water retention, and build the next generation of our environmental, champions. So we really tried to aim for a lot of issues from the start, but also the idea was to create a foundation. We're only investing in a smaller number of schools compared to the problem, but we need to start somewhere and we need to create the foundation. So I just want to give you a flavor of some of the schools. Next slide. So this school in Bucharest, it's in Sector 6, which is one of the poorer areas of Bucharest. It actually doesn't look that bad from the outside. It's actually two buildings built in 1930s and 1940s. Actually, that building there was bombed in World War II, but reconstructed. But since World War II, it's had one renovation, and that is someone decided to finance energy efficiency insulation panels in 2011. Now, I'll show you the next photos and you can question why somebody decided to put energy efficiency insulation panels on this building. It's also a very high urban poor area, high Roma population, double shift schooling. Next slide, please. So this is a trip inside the building. So the roof leaks, the water floods from the bottom. Every time it rains, the basement floods. That is a heater that is, the heating is done with wood fires. So elementary school and wood fires, one can imagine that's not the best combination. The disability ramps are too high and meet the lips of buildings that a wheelchair could not go over. The building itself is crumbling. And that very nice classroom you see up to the left is in the attic of the school. Looks very nice, except that's actually the room for the disabled children. So it's up in the attic where the children can't actually get up there. So, there's some nods to disability inclusion, but it's actually not there. And the school is high risk from pretty much every dynamic that you can think of. And the fact that, people are looking at sort of one solution, put a ramp up and think we've solved the problem of access, or put some energy efficiency panels on and say we met sustainability. That's what we're trying to change this dynamic. Next slide, please. Again, this building looks kind of nice. It's had some nice energy efficiency panels, but the lower floor has zero ventilation, floods, is covered in mold, and there's actually an old Nazi fuel depot underneath that courtyard that leaks into the basement. And very high seismic risk. It's again in a poor urban area with high Roma population, double shift schooling, and again, impossible access for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. And this is an example of a school in a rural area, a very poor rural area, an old adobe construction school, which is, despite the best efforts of the Roma community, has a leaky roof, wood fires. It is a very poor community, and they are really trying to do their level best to keep this school functional. I will also point out that on the top left happens to be the saddest playground I've ever seen. It is a monument, a slide, and that is the playground for the school. So, you know, there's an opportunity here when we look at integrated solutions to build a school for a community that is a hub for the entire community and safe and where children want to go. And to be honest, I wouldn't want to go to these schools. In an hour in one of these schools, I was left with asthma and a migraine just from the sheer amount of mold. So I can imagine why children don't go to school. So I think as a team, we're very proud of this project. And I think looking at the integration aspect, I think has been like the most successful part of it. So we show a video now, which is, you know, hopefully inspires everyone to think about integration and inclusion.
După ce termin gimnaziul, vreau să mă duc la un liceu bun, mai departe să mă duc la facultatea de drept și să devin avocat.
Vreau să mă fac actriță. Să termin liceul și mai târziu să dau la facultatea de drept.
Mie îmi place biologia pentru că sunt pasionată de corpul uman. Mi-ar plăcea să fiu doctor.
Pasiunea mea este fotbalul, îmi place de când eram mic copil.
Să ajut eu, să știu eu că zâmbesc ceilalți ca să pot zâmbi și eu.
Aș vrea să fac școala profesională, să devin mecanic.
Când o să fiu mare, să devin doctor ortoped, să ajut oamenii. Să-mi deplinesc dorința, trebuie să fac foarte mulți ani de școală. Școala este cel mai important lucru.
Eu vreau să le ofer copiilor mei ceea ce eu n-am avut. Toată susținerea mea, atât financiar cât și mai mult de mamă. Vreau să fiu și mentor și toate la un loc. Este dorința mea cea mai mare, să-i văd cum am visat eu să fiu de mică. Eu am visat să fiu asistentă medicală. Învățam mult și părinții nu m-au susținut în condițiile în care ei nu erau bine financiar, adică am terminat doar 8 clase și le mulțumesc și pentru asta că sunt copii care n-au putut să facă nici 8 clase.
Trebuia să merg înainte, că am avut note bune și mi-a părut rău că, uite, n-am o meserie care trebuia să o am. Pentru că școala asta te dezvoltă, știi ce e în lume, știi ce se petrece în lume. E altceva școala.
Oriunde te duci, mereu te întreabă de școală.
Să se angajeze și ei undeva, să-și găsească o profesie mai bună. Asta își doresc toate mamele pentru copiilor și noi aici ne dorim.
Pentru cultura generală, pentru mentalitate, pentru discriminare, că noi întotdeauna suntem discriminați fiindcă suntem romi.
Unii dintre părinți mai au acele concepții în care dacă nici eu n-am reușit, nici tu n-o să reușești.
Eu aici zic că problema nu sunt numai copiii, sunt și părinții care nu le place să-și lasă copiii să învețe, să le schimbă un pic mentalitatea, educația, portul.
Pentru că asta e tradiția noastră. Dacă te măriți, nu poți să te mai duci la școală. Așa e la noi. Și orice pe lumea asta, orice lege din lumea asta nu poate să ne schimbă tradiția.
Îmi doresc foarte mult să meargă la școală, să-și termine școala, dar în condiții mai bune, să avem niște condiții mai bune în școală. Să aibă niște bănci mai noi, mai confortabile, că sunt niște bănci mici.
Eu îmi doresc o școală mai mare pentru că suntem foarte mulți în clasă, suntem în catalog 44 de copii și nu avem decât 25 de bănci. Asta mi-ar dori cel mai mult.
De-a lungul anilor ne-am tot confruntat cu problema lipsa spațiului. Lipsa spațiului pentru orice înseamnă activități extrașcolare. Lipsa spațiului pentru a desfășura și activitățile de educație fizică în mod normal.
Aceasta din spatele meu este o clădire foarte veche, de prin anii 56. Miroase a igrasie, e infiltrat în pereți, este deasupra unui beci. Cloacarele sunt foarte vechi și nu mai funcționează.
Terenul ăsta, adică dicul ăsta care a venit până aici, toată țigănia ține, pentru a alerga, pentru a face ceva. Avem copii minunați. Dacă se dezvoltă ceva aici, eu cred și 100%, dacă e dezvoltat aici, adică dacă are condițiile, o să avem copii peste o vreme, 5-10 ani, care o să-i vedem la televizor. Eu așa gândesc.
Thanks, and over to Sanjay.
Thank you, Lana. Thank you, Zoe. This is fascinating. I was not aware that the categories that you'd found out in your portfolio review were so thorough, but I was learning from me as well. So thank you for that. I will focus mainly on 3 points: the process that we followed in this community vulnerability assessment, the slight twist that we had, and then some of the key findings and the next steps that, this is a work in progress. The project's just about to start implementation, so a lot of the findings that we have will, hopefully, fingers crossed, find themselves in the project and other interventions. We very well know what inclusion is. All of us do. We've been talking about it. It's in most of the documents. In this project, it's been in the title of the project as well, inclusive schools. Now, the problem that we always run into in several of the projects that I've worked with, not just this, is the how. And given the timeframes that we have, we often get stuck in terms of, have we identified the right people, the right vulnerable and poor people, marginalized people, or have we gone out to, the main groups that we think are vulnerable and marginalized? Now, all of us know that if we don't identify them properly, then engaging them is out of question because we've not identified them. And as Sami rightly mentioned, there is a huge amount of intersectionality as well. In this example, what we tried to do was, a bit of the same, but with a little bit of a twist. In terms of the process, it was quite simple. As you know, under the environmental social framework, under the various bank policies, we also have a directive to include marginalized and vulnerable people, which is applicable to bank staff. We do go out and do social assessment. Sometimes it's an environmental social assessment, it goes by different names. In this particular project, given the time and resources that we had available, it was prepared under a really rushed way. As I guess happens in most projects these days. We decided not to do a classic social assessment. We did a community vulnerability assessment, which just focused on identifying the vulnerable and marginalized groups to the best, and individuals to the best extent possible. Next, please. Now, the twist that so just one more slide on the process. Essentially, since we weren't allowed to go there ourselves due to COVID-19 restrictions, we engaged a local consulting firm in Core who did this excellent piece of work. They identified, over different groups, but interviewed either over the phone, Skype, or in person, wherever possible, around 240 individuals, in a really short time frame, literally 20 days in 12 selected communities. At that point of time, we did not know which schools would be included in the project. So, it was more of a sample of schools in low income or lower middle income regions where we thought that the project could actually fund those types of schools. I won't get into this, but essentially most of the interviews were conducted with, actual school children with the consent of parents. And the results we got, you'll see later in the next slide, please. The twist that I was talking about is because we had limited time, capacity, and funds, we said, okay, let's identify the more common or the more well-known vulnerable groups, as we call them, upfront. And this was done very quickly. Some of us sat together, okay, it's the usual ones: Roma children, children with disabilities, children from poor families, children living in remote areas, the constraints that came up in Zoe's presentation as well. And we requested in court to go there, obviously meet with, a cross-section of children from these groups, but also try to find other marginalized and vulnerable groups. And this is where it became really interesting, because these were groups which might have fallen through the cracks, or individuals which might have fallen through the cracks. And I would like to again emphasize intersectionality. A child could be in multiple slots. So these are not mutually exclusive categories, at all. But just to give you an example, or some examples of what types, of children which would have otherwise fallen through the cracks, children from families with many siblings. And fine, we knew about Roma families, but even Pentecostal families, they have larger number of children, and then all children there cannot get equal access to education. Similarly, children who come from poorer families, or from who have illiterate parents, or even children who are enrolled in school at a later stage, meaning they missed the first few years of schooling, and then they're in the same classroom but with children who are much younger, or children who did not attend kindergarten, so it's not easy for them to pick up concepts that way. Children in fragile family contexts, because children with relatives, because the parents have migrated abroad, and there is quite a bit of migration into the EU countries, other EU countries, more richer EU countries from Romania. So this number is quite sizable. We do know about single parent households. Children, brought up in single parent households have problems in accessing education as compared to a normal household. But they're also children in emotional distress. So you have children experiencing discrimination, violence, physical, verbal abuse, and we saw quite a few quotes on this, would get into it. There were also children with limited digital access opportunities. They didn't have enough tablets at home, or they had to share one smartphone to attend classes. And so there's a whole issue of digital access that we came up with as well. And obviously children at risk of dropping out of school. So just with this short piece of work, we're able to expand these categories. And that's what I call is the twist, because now at least we've been able to identify these other groups or individuals, and now it becomes easier to listen to what their needs are, etc., etc. Next slide, please. These are just a few selected quotes from the focus groups, and they're so powerful that we thought we should have a slide specifically on this. Just to read out a couple, we were drawing our girls from school because there's no transportation. In winter, the days become short, the girls stay longer at school, and we can't take them back home because we have other children. So, and later in the evenings, boys would stalk the girls. So they end up just not sending girls to school. Or we don't have enough money for anything. The school asks for many things, but we can't afford them. We're 12 people eating at the table. At school, they get no food. We pack some snacks. If we have something to pack, if we don't, they stay hungry till they get home. There's another quote again about elder children, children outside the cohort age group. Children are ashamed to go to school because the older ones should have been in classes with the younger ones. The kids started laughing at him. You're with your brother. You're held back in a grade, and so on. And so he stopped going to school. Now, if you look at, and we have a huge list of them. Some of them, there are more quotes in a note that's finally going to come out. It's in the final stages of publication. It'll be uploaded on the KSP website as well. But this just kind of gives you a sense of the different types of findings that we get. And if we just go through some of the other key findings, we found out, as I mentioned earlier, that the government would provide tablets because during COVID, they had remote education or virtual education, but the parents would be scared of taking the tablet or had reservations about accepting the tablet because there's a condition that it should be returned in the same condition that was given. And they knew this would probably not happen with children, using it, breaking it, and they would have to pay the money. So they ended up saying, no, we don't want the tablet. Similarly, you have instances of very powerful cases in which there's one old smartphone and there are 6 children at home and they have to share, and they have to because they just have one phone to access online learning. And it's always a challenge. And that too, if the phone's old and there are problems of electricity, then the battery dies very quickly. So, they are excluded. And you see, so many things like this. Next, please.
Sanjay, sorry, we're going to have to wrap up and continue
Yes.
to the next two. If you can just wrap up, thanks.
Sure. So this here, as you can see, is just what we did with the recommendations. We have a huge list of recommendations, which we won't get into. But the idea is to collect such recommendations from each school and then pass them on to either some of the recommendations can be accepted and implemented through the project. Others would go to the school boards, then to the local authorities, and finally the ministry. And that's the stage where we are at in. We will be sending all these, and we've sent some of these already to the ministry, but that dialogue is still happening. And let's hope we get several of these recommendations in. But I think that was it. Back to you, Zoe.
No, thank you so much to Alana and Sanjay for this great example. It's very tangible, I thought, and especially seeing people talk about their kids and the kids themselves about their lives and their hopes and dreams. I think it's really it's powerful. So looking forward to the note that Sanjay mentioned. That'll be something also on our KSB. Now, on the website, I'd like to hand over to Mirta Escobar. She's a disaster risk management specialist also working at GFDRR, and she's going to give us a bit more detail on sort of the plans for the KSB. And this is great to get your feedback. And these are kind of our ideas, but of course, as Sami mentioned, the KSB is shaped by the people who are in it. So looking forward to hearing from you all. Go ahead, Mirta, thanks.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Good morning. It's really great to have you all this morning. Also, as Zoe mentioned, the KSB is a very important part of the World Bank knowledge management. And of course, the objective is to effectively manage the knowledge generated through World Bank projects to maximize impact for clients, right? That being our ultimate goal. Thank you, Yusra. As well, that as you know, the GPearl has taken a good look at all the KSBs. And so I mentioned a lot of work has been done and has been produced. So really with the consolidation and relaunching of this KSB, we were looking is to maximize the impact of the knowledge, but not only mobilizing it, but also by increasing the operational impact. So we see ourselves in like a stage 3 and moving towards a stage 4. Now, like the priorities have been identified. We feel that there is a good streaming of knowledge, but we really want to move ahead with mobilizing it, consolidating it, and moving to increase operational impact. Next, please. One important thing is that disaster risk management, of course, multi-sectorial by nature. So when we add the intersection with social inclusion, we see that there are a lot of opportunities. So I mentioned a lot of this had been identified as part of the stock-taking exercise. And we saw as part of listening, as part of this review, but also listening to a consultation, that understanding the barriers that marginalized communities face during, before, and after disaster situations provide an opportunity to see how we can integrate it in all our projects. In particular for this KSB, the demand for consolidated knowledge responds to 4 main opportunities and entry points that we have identified. The corporate commitments, of course, that are an important entry point. Also, Sami mentioned in his opening remarks the increase for resilient, sustainable, and inclusive operations. We have seen this as well, and the inclusion component being part of the PDOs and part of the results framework. So we do see that there is a need for additional guidance and ensure that all that knowledge that is available at the bank can be put at the can make available to task teams. Also, we see a lot of opportunities to work across global practices, and it was the case of Romania. It's so important to showcase these examples and also to see how we can learn from them, how it can be replicated, how that can be scalable. And then in particular for GFDRR and leading the agenda at the bank level in disaster risk management, social inclusion has been included as part of the operating principles as a cross-cutting area. So we see really an opportunity for allowing more targeted support to the technical assistance that we provide. Next. In the exercise that we did a bit to prepare for what the work program and what the activities would look like, there was an extensive review not only of documentation, but as I mentioned, consultation with regional teams. So in order to shape the engagement, we identify kind of like gaps and the ideas of how we are going to target and what the opportunities that we see. And of course, I don't think this will come as a surprise, but there is limited availability of consolidated resources, tool, and guidance, limited availability of analytics and standard data sources, limited access to disaggregated data and data collection methods, and fragmented and limited systematization of a scalable approach for inclusive DRM. And also, like just to mention, this is specifically on that intersection between disaster risk management and social inclusion. No? Like I think in other KSBs, there is other areas that also have identified similar gaps and have taken actions also to seek opportunities on how to bridge them. Just to go very quickly in terms of what are we doing, what do we see that we can go moving forward. Of course, advancing the knowledge of learning agenda is at the core of the KSB. For this, we're going to implement activities such as the design of evidence-based methods for collect, disseminate, analyze disaggregated data based on what we are seeing in other projects. Also providing technical assistance and capacity building. This is going to be a strong component on training to share efforts and increase internal and external capacity, no? To mainstream inclusive DRM. And in third opportunity, creating partnerships and advocating for inclusive approaches to DRM, we see an opportunity to develop targeted and context-based solution that enables scalability of the approaches to mainstream. So we do see like there is not one solution that would fit all, but we do see the opportunity on systematizing information. Next, please. So we have worked to prepare a work program that will be supported through the KSB. Of course, the idea is to leverage additional impact by working with external and internal partners across region, as well as task teams working. And also we have a good opportunity to work with the teams that are implementing GFDRR grants. This is a work in progress, of course. We're open to suggestions, and our idea and our ultimate objective is to build a demand-driven work program. So just to give you an idea, and I'm not going to go into detail, but like what we're thinking about is developing knowledge products such as review emergency projects across countries, identify lessons learned, entry points, gaps, type of indicators that can be used. And this is has one of the areas that has been mentioned by teams as being challenging. In terms of workshops as well, we are planning a gender-based violence and DRM a workshop that we think it will be great to inform, and it's a topic also that is emerging and that we have received requests to add it as part of the KSB. And then in terms of knowledge management, I mean, there is like a multiple of opportunities, but two areas that had been identified by a lot of the teams is to build a roster of consultants. It's a specialized knowledge, and it's really good to have those resources and also to hear from other teams that have work and that understand, consultants that understand what the work entails. So we're working on doing that. And as well, some compilation of TORs. Now there is a lot of work that teams have been doing, a lot of lessons learned from that. So we think that this can help also teams to advance the agenda more swiftly. No. In terms of the work program, we hope that is helpful, we hope that is practical, and we do recognize that some strides have been made to incorporate inclusive approaches to recovery, response and recovery efforts. I mean, we saw it clearly in the case of Romania, but also acknowledge that more work is needed to incorporate even more good practices, lessons learned, and ultimately ensure that we contribute to long-term disaster and climate risk management at a systemic and, if possible, at a policy level. With that, I just leave you with an invitation to please reach out to me and Zoe and help us build this work plan. As Zoe, as Same also mentioned, the idea really is to utilize this momentum and to make the KSB stronger as time goes. No, so really get involved and try to maintain the conversations, the discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mirta. So just to also mention, we're running a bit tight on time, but please do, if you have any questions, you can pop them in the chat, or as Mirta mentioned, you can shoot an email to me or Mirta. But now I'd like to pass the microphone to Sonia Sultan, who is Global Lead for Social Inclusion, and she's Senior Social Development Specialist for the Social Sustainability and Inclusion Global Practice in the South Asia region. So Sonia is going to kind of comment a bit on what she heard today and give us her thoughts going forward. Sonia?
Thank you so much, Zoe, and I'll be very mindful of time and be very short. So first of all, I really wanted to congratulate you, Mirta, the whole GP, and Same for being so supportive of this agenda. This whole GP has really been at the forefront of really trying to operationalize inclusion and go beyond sort of talking about it to figuring out how we do it in practice. And it's fantastic to see. All the sort of main messages that you and the other team from Romania and Mirta have shared with us are very much in line with the key messages and approaches we have in the global solutions group around social inclusion, which is very much trying to be across GP, across the bank forum for discussion and engagement. So first, I just want to take a couple of minutes to respond to some of the points raised or emphasize them, and then just want to tell you a little bit about how we would love to engage with you from the social inclusion GSG. So first, just as Same has mentioned, it's really worth noting the high level of commitment to this agenda at the moment. Whether you look at the development communique from the annual meetings, the emphasis on the grid agenda and inclusive recovery, the number of commitments around inclusion or inclusive services in the IDA 20 policy commitments, there's a unique momentum now and commitment to moving forward with this. Next slide, please. But actually, just like you have shown in your portfolio reviews, when we've done sort of a short snapshot of a couple of regions and looked at various GPs' recovery operations, inclusive recovery, we found quite similar things, that there's a lot of knowledge. Most projects acknowledge the issues, but sometimes it's quite hard to translate the identification of groups and risks into concrete actions, and then finally into measuring our impact in terms of inclusion. Next slide, please. So like you, the framework and the key principles we've sort of highlighted are very much about identifying excluded groups. And just I wanted to pick up the point about, from your portfolio review, you've identified some major groups. It's always worth remembering that what Sanjay and team highlighted, that context matters. So yes, we have some sense of the bigger groups, but it's always worth thinking whether in a particular context or sector, there are other groups we wouldn't normally think about. And the point of that several people have made, intersectionality. So even when we're looking at gender and the gender tag, are we looking at the most vulnerable women or the women most likely to be excluded? So women from sexual minorities or women with disabilities, women from a religious minority. Not to say that we expect every project to address everything. And I guess one key point I wanted to make is teams should not feel overwhelmed and think every project has to have a comprehensive analysis and has to identify all the groups and actions for all the groups. I think it's about being very pragmatic. Find the openings with the governments and partners you work with, see where you can make progress, and identify a few places where maybe you can push the agenda a little bit further forward. Nobody is expecting sort of systems of exclusion that have been around for centuries to collapse through one World Bank project. But I think the main message is we try every time where we can. Next slide, please. The other key point I also wanted to raise was we often also focus a lot on project design, but the process, and I think some people have mentioned this as well, so including excluded groups throughout the process and engaging them in the design, in the implementation, through all your citizen engagement activities. That's also a key step. Next slide, please. Next one, please. I'm going to skip this. This is things you've heard already. So I just finally wanted to end with saying that we're very excited about collaborating with the urban and DRM GP on several fronts. So there's this KSB, there's a few others coming up on inclusive cities. And we feel that there's a lot of things we're trying to achieve in common where we can help each other and work together. In the Global Solutions Group on Social Inclusion, we're very focused on not more analytical work at the global level, but really trying to help regional teams, task teams, government implement things. So providing operational and technical guidance, disseminating knowledge both from within the bank and outside. Again, if you have best practice examples you would like to share, please share them with the wider community. We have people who struggled with some of the same issues some of you may face. So it's also a community to support each other. And one of the key areas this particular year will be focusing on the COVID response. We're hoping that as an institution, we can have a more systematic approach to addressing inclusion in the COVID recovery operations. Next slide, please. So the last thing I wanted to just say, next slide, that it's not just me, there's a whole team in the Global Solutions Group, in SSI, people who work on gender, disability, SOGI, indigenous people and ethnic minorities. So there's a group of people and a lot of resources, and I hope we'll be able to work together on a lot of these agendas. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sonia. I think that's really great. I think it's a key point too, is not to get overwhelmed, because I also find sometimes there's so many issues. It's really important to be pragmatic and to do the best that you can. And that's kind of what we're trying to do, you know, working with you and others to link up teams, just finding these practical solutions. And there's a lot of information out there, and I know it can be a bit of an overload sometimes too. So to try and help teams sift through that and make sense of it all and include sort of these aspects from the get-go in the process. We've actually come to the end of our time. Same had to run. He's chairing another event at 9, but he asked me to thank everyone for your participation. And I'd also like to thank again the speakers and of course all of you for joining. In the chat, I saw there was a link to joining the social inclusion GSG. Of course, I think please also contact me. We're not quite as organized with the Survey Monkey yet for the for this KSB, but so please do reach out and let us know, and we will follow up. We've recorded the event. We'll share the PowerPoint as well as the notes, the note on Romania Sanjay mentioned, as well as the stock take and portfolio review that I shared. And so just thanks again to everyone, and we look forward to your active participation, and please don't hesitate to reach out as well to Sonia. Thank you, guys. Have a good day. Have a good night, Sonia. Taka. Thanks for coming.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Have a good day or evening. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.